Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to two weaknesses of US geography. Now, ever since I was recommended this video to react to, I was been quite intrigued about what these weaknesses could be, because I always thought that geographically the US was in a really strong position. You know, it's really hard to invade, you know, a lot of land, a lot of coastline. But then I thought, you know, maybe there are weaknesses that, you know, me, who in no means am I a geographical expert, you know, these weaknesses possibly aren't that obvious, but I know that I'm going to find this video really interesting to watch, so let's do it.
A common assumption about the United States is that the country is the most strategically blessed in the world. From a geographical standpoint, the United States sits in an invaluable position. Not only is its vast territory filled with lush forests and land perfect for agriculture, but it is also rich in oil and mineral wealth, with internal waterways and protected harbors that give a natural advantage transporting these goods. Externally, the U.S. only has land borders with two neighbors, Mexico and Canada, which, aside from minor threats to the U.S. like the ever-contentious Mexican border, and the seemingly unstoppable takeover of Canadian pop music, both neighbors currently maintain strong and close relations with Washington. The lack of military and economic rivals on the North American continent has ensured the U.S.'s dominance over the region. If compared to Europe, for example, the presence of evenly matched strategic states competing for the same limited resources led to numerous bloody wars, the last of which ended with World War II. Whereas for the US, the last major conflict on the North American continent happened in 1836 with Santa Anna's disastrous expedition, which, if successful, could have led Mexico and not the US to dominate North America. Perhaps—
Wow, I had no idea that conflict happened. I really need to improve my history knowledge.
Most importantly, unfettered access to two oceans created the foundations of the U.S. power, both at the economic and military levels. The U.S. economy leverages its position between Europe and Asia. Of the top 15 trading countries with the U.S., 6 are in Asia and 7 are in Europe.
So it's quite even.
The seas had, and still do play, a central role in the U.S. global power status. Having secured its land borders, the U.S. security can only be threatened via the seas. With this extreme bubble of safety, Washington's focus since the Second World War has been on projecting its power externally.
Yeah, that's why the U.S. Navy is just so huge and powerful and diverse in its power as well.
And American power projection is now second to none in the world. Its stealth strategic bombers can fly undetected to the other side of the globe in a matter of hours. Its strategic airlifters can reposition troops in a matter of days. And its aircraft carriers, continuously sailing through the seas, can, in a matter of weeks, project America's clout in virtually every corner of the world. However, despite this strength, the United States' ubiquitous domination is being challenged on multiple fronts.
Is it? By who?
Historically, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans provided formidable obstacles to any power seeking to invade the American mainland. The last notable attack on U.S. territory took Imperial Japan years of preparation and massive resources to strike Pearl Harbor. And that's still halfway from the U.S. mainland. Unlike its main strategic competitors, the U.S. benefits from direct access to the open sea. As you can see from a previous video, China is limited by the choke points on the first island chain, and Russia suffers from the dearth of warm water ports. However, America's resilience on the seas is also its Achilles heel.
Could what he mentioned about Russia be the reason, or one of the reasons behind, you know, this whole Ukraine situation, or is that completely unrelated?
America's main potential weakness could be caused by climate change. Melting ice in the Arctic is opening up new sea lanes of communication from the northern Atlantic into the northern Pacific. the Northwest Passage following the northern US and Canadian coastline, and the Northeast Passage along Russia's northern shores. Even though the usage of these routes is still limited from May to October, more and more ships are now sailing through these waters. Steaming through the Arctic seas allows ships to shave weeks off of navigation on the northern Europe, Asia, and US West Coast routes. The majority of maps depict the Americas and Asia as two opposite extremes, but these are pretty much only separated by the Bering Strait.
Yeah, I heard that a lot of the maps, or most of the maps that we get, aren't really accurate in terms of how big countries are and how big the bodies of water really are. I want to try and find like a globe or a map that's as accurate, like 100% accurate.
At its narrowest, between Siberia and Alaska, there's only a 55-mile gap, around 89 kilometers. This means that the increasingly growing trade flow through the Arctic will be under the crosshairs of not only the US, but also Russian control. And a more assertive Russian naval presence in the Atlantic and Pacific is a main source of concern for the US. This, coupled with Russia's increasingly assertive leadership, threatens to rekindle the Cold War dynamic that challenged the United States for much of the 20th century.
What do you guys think of this whole Russia-Ukraine situation? Like, me personally, like from what I've seen, like I've tried to watch some media from Russia and Ukraine, and it does seem that the level of potential conflict is lower. Like, it seems that the citizens of Russia and Ukraine don't think that they are that close to conflict, whereas here in the UK and in America, it's the media's quite alarmist. They're really saying, oh, they're on the brink of war, this and that, or invasion. What do you guys think? Because I don't really think that it's going to escalate, at least not soon.
The rise of global temperature could drastically improve Russia's geostrategic milieu, as Russia's northern and Pacific fleets could gain unlimited access to the seas, even during winter months in the coming decades. Until now, the lack of warm water ports has been a major deficit in the USSR and then Russian naval power projection capability, limiting its surface vessel activities in the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Russia's Navy Northern Fleet bases are mostly located close to the border with Finland, in the Kola Peninsula and around the White Sea, as the warm Gulf Stream guarantees ice-free waters all year round. As you can see from the map, this means that the majority of Russia's military ships and submarines are focused on one single area, roughly the size of Virginia. This makes these ship routes more predictable and observable by Russia's opponents. The area...
Right, but because this body of water is opening up, it's going to be a lot harder to track and monitor and use surveillance on them.
Extending from the Kara Sea up to the Sea of Japan is instead much colder and prone to freeze during winter months. These satellite pictures show how the Pacific Fleet main ports freeze during winter, making the use of icebreakers crucial for military operations. Whereas during the Cold War, the only way that the USSR's Pacific Fleet could have threatened the US during the winter months was via its nuclear submarines, silently slipping under the thick Arctic ice. Now, with a continuously changing environment, Russia can leverage on its surface fleet in the region too, greatly expanding its operational capabilities. The US is late to the Arctic game. Whereas Russia has been hawkish on the region since the early 2000s, the US has only recently adopted measures. In October 2018, for the first time in 30 years, an aircraft carrier operated in the Arctic Circle. This renewed interest from the United States is likely helped by Russia's particularly assertive position in recent years. Moscow committed to a massive infrastructure overhaul.
How long has Vladimir Putin been president in Russia? I feel like it's almost 20 years now. Like, don't they have term limits in Russia? Because usually it's 2 terms, I think. In the US, it's 2 terms. In the UK, it's 3 terms. You can be prime minister for 3 terms. Same thing with Germany, I think. Whereas in Russia and China, you can just go on and on and on and on. Like,
including bringing former Soviet assets back online and building new bases and radar capacity. The U.S. is also significantly out-tooled in this region. For example, icebreakers are an essential tool in the frigid Arctic climate. And while Russia boasts approximately 50 icebreakers among its newer and its legacy vessels, the U.S. can only count on one operational ship. Climate change and the consequent ice melting happening in the Arctic is shaping the U.S. strategic environment, opening new possibilities to its Cold War competitor. For Russia,
But with climate change and, the glaciers in the Antarctic melting down, over time there's going to be less and less glaciers. So is there really going to be a need to have all these icebreakers? If most of the ice is already dissolved?
By enemies on its European and Siberian borders, gaining more operational freedom in the Atlantic, and most importantly, the Pacific, allows it to get more negotiation cards in its limited deck against Washington. If the northern Arctic ice is still potentially threatening, the Caribbean's sun-kissed tropical waters play a host to a far more direct menace to the U.S. Cuba perhaps embodies the single greatest geotopical threat to the contemporary United States for
really
two
close
primary reasons. First, its overall proximity to the U.S. coast and mainland.
Super close.
And second, the danger this poses to the critical assets points into the Gulf of Mexico. Metaphorically speaking, Cuba is like a dagger pointed straight at the United States' economic underbelly.
It's interesting because it's so close and, it has this, it poses this potential threat. I would have thought that the relations between Cuba and the US would be fantastic. I would have thought the US would do everything it could to make sure that they're in a good place, both economically and socially. But it seems that there's a lot of restrictions placed on Cuba by the US, at least like trading and stuff like that. Yeah, I think Obama, he lifted partially some restrictions, I think, but there's still some, I believe.
From a geographical standpoint, Cuba sits right at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, creating two major bottlenecks, which funnel the in- and outbound sea traffic. The first expands from Cuba's northern coast up to the Florida Keys, where the second starts from Cuba's southeastern shore down to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. These two choke points measure around 90 miles, or around 145 kilometers, and 125 miles, 201 kilometers, respectively, distances made irrelevant by modern anti-ship missiles. But why is the Gulf of Mexico so important? Strategically speaking, if New Orleans is the door to North America, the Gulf of Mexico is its front yard. New Orleans is so strategic because it connects the ocean to the majority of the western U.S. via the Mississippi River complex. This river, which is fed further inland by the Missouri, Ohio...
I have to say, I love these this graphic he's used. All of these lights and stuff like that. I wonder how he made this. Really cool.
Arkansas and Tennessee rivers was central to the United States' early success and is still a critical source of strategic and economic strength to the country. As river barges that transport goods from the inland cannot take on the rough seas towards Europe, the seafaring ship's dimension won't physically allow these vessels to sail upstream. Thus, the ports on the Mississippi estuaries connect the U.S. heartland with the sea, making this shipping infrastructure extremely important for the U.S. economy and internal health. The Mississippi is a direct line for huge amounts of crops, minerals, and manufactured goods between the U.S. heartland and its ocean-sea trade routes. And, in return, it ties many of the U.S. states together. It has been estimated that every year, around 175 million of freight are moved via barge down the river.
Wow.
And that stopping the river's traffic for just one day would generate losses for $300 million.
So yeah, this thing here, you can bet that it's protected in a lot of ways, because that's a lot of revenue that's generated just through moving all of this this freight.
Perhaps even more critically, the Mississippi River Delta is home to extremely valuable and extremely fragile assets that underpin multi-billion-dollar industries such as petroleum extraction and refining, chemical production, and fisheries. As around 70% of the U.S. trade is seaborne, the geographic location of its main ports become a critical issue. Of the U.S. top 5 biggest trading ports per volume in 2019, 4 are in the Gulf of Mexico. Ships to and from the ports of South Louisiana, Houston, Corpus Christi, and Beaumont all have to pass through the 2 bottlenecks created by Cuba, exposing all this traffic to possible disruptions. For any major foreign power aiming at threatening Washington's mainland security, the Caribbean islands offer the best possible place to implement such a plan. This is also the reason that Cuba has been at the center of some of the U.S. most significant conflicts and political crises, namely the catalyst for the war with Spain
and the Cuban Missile Crisis
in 1898, and perhaps most famously with the USSR in 1963, the closest the world has come so far
to nuclear
annihilation.
Yeah.
In the absence of challenges over land and strong rivals to attack it from the sea, for any U.S. competitors, Cuba offers the most effective way to menace the U.S. The 1963 missile crisis is a perfect example. At the time, the USSR was way behind the US in terms of long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bomber capabilities. Whereas the US could directly point its weapons at Russia, there was no other way around. Moscow, which was lacking any diplomatic bargaining chip with the US, saw in Cuba not only a friendly communist regime, but also the strategic ally that could...
Wasn't it Che Guevara who was in charge of Cuba at that time, I think? I think it was him.
Bring Soviet power directly to U.S. shores. Though the U.S.'s geography has allowed it to have ideal geostrategic conditions, U.S. reliance on the seas for trade expose its flank to possible weaknesses, the major of which remains Cuba and its strategic location close to the U.S. mainland and at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico. The second threat lies in the shift in the U.S.'s competitors' geostrategic milieu caused by climate change and the consequent Arctic thaw. In particular, Russia's Pacific and Arctic ports, usually frozen in winter, could gain direct access to the sea, expanding Russia's operational capabilities and giving Moscow one more card to play in the negotiations with Washington.
That's true. That was a really interesting video. Like the 2 key takeaways for me are that we do need to try and get some kind of just get a lid on climate change, because with a lot of the glaciers melting away in the Antarctic, it does open up a lot of sea routes that previously would have been impossible to navigate through. And also, but to be fair, the point about Cuba, I don't see. Obviously, I'm not based in that region, but I don't see Cuba ever allowing, an enemy nation of the US to use it as some kind of base or anything like that. Just because Cuba would be, they'd be pretty much putting themselves at huge risk. I just don't see that happening, but really, really interesting video. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.